Okay, so we are going to get started right now. We're not going to waste any time because we have a very jam-packed hour, but thanks everyone for being here. And today we are going to talk all about how states are leveraging the USDA Local Food for Schools Cooperative Agreement Program with state-level local food purchasing incentives. We call these LFPIs or LFPIs or incentives for short, and Local Food for Schools we call LFS. I am Cassandra Bull. I am a policy specialist with the National Farm to School Network and your panel moderator for today. This webinar is brought to you as a collaboration with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems and my lovely colleague, Colleen Matz, who's the Farm to Institution specialist there, and the National Farm to School Network. Today, I'm going to give a very short overview of LFPIs and LFS. Then our panel, we're going to have 3 different panel sections that are broken up by topic, and I'll explain those later. And then we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions during this hour, please enter them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Okay, so first about local food purchasing incentives. These are programs that provide additional funding to directly offset the cost of local foods. These are typically funded and operated at the state level, and they intend to increase purchasing of local foods in K through 12 and or early childcare and education settings. And to date, there have been at least 17 local food purchasing incentive programs funded and established dating all the way back to 2001. So they've been around for a while. And we're talking about incentives in the context of the USDA Local Food for Schools Cooperative Agreement Program, LFS. This was launched in spring of last year, 2022. It's billed as a one-time infusion of funds as part of the COVID-19 relief program. This is a non-competitive cooperative agreement program from the USDA to different state departments, and it offers up to $200 million in funding from the Commodity Credit Corporation. And because of that, most of the purchases can go to local, unprocessed, or minimally processed foods. This program prioritizes what the USDA calls socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, and small businesses. And food is to be served in schools participating in the National School Lunch and Breakfast programs. I also just want to mention shortly that there's a whole myriad of federal relief programs, such as the Local Food Purchasing Assistance Program, the Farm to School State Formula Grants, and Supply Chain Assistance Funds, among many others. So you'll be hearing a little bit about those during this hour too. So we're here to talk about incentives and LFS and how they sort of mingle together and intersect. And so the first section will be we'll be hearing from 2 representatives of states with really robust and longstanding incentive programs. And we're going to hear from Jaime Malnar and Rick Sherman about how their existing incentives were supported the implementation of LFS funds, and also how LFS funds were used to expand their incentive programs. Next, we'll be hearing from 2 folks in states that didn't have incentives when LFS came about, and they'll be talking about how they strategically positioned LFS as a pilot for permanent state-level investment into a permanent incentive program. And lastly, we'll be hearing from, I want to back up. So there we'll be hearing from Monica Pacheco of the Connecticut Department of Education and Eliana Pinilla of the Common Market, who will be representing Illinois. And lastly, we'll be hearing how some states reimagined local food purchasing incentives through unique models, like contracting directly with producers instead of schools, which is the traditional incentive model that we've seen. So really innovative stuff, and they're coming at it from 2 different angles. So we're going to be hearing from Erica Lamson of the Washington State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and Jessica Petrolia of the Rhode Island Department of Education. And if you're interested in that last section about what those two folks have to say, we're holding a policy roundtable called Envisioning Farmer-Focused Local Food Purchasing Incentives, all about how states can contract directly with producers to sell local food into schools. And that will be on October 11th, and we'll put the registration in the chat. Okay, so now we're going to hear from Jaime and Rick Sherman. Jaime, my first question is for you. So how have you been able to incorporate LFS into your existing incentive program in Michigan?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. My name is Jaime Malnar. I work for the Michigan Department of Education. I actually oversee the USDA Foods program, and I still work with our farm to school team. I think that's kind of important to mention that because I think a lot of states have limited staff resources. So that kind of helped guide us as to how we were going to plan our program. So when the grant was announced, we were excited because obviously schools needed assistance with supply chain issues. And we had also noticed that during COVID, a lot of schools in Michigan, at least our farm to school champions, really leaned into some of the partnerships they had with local growers. So we were excited about it. Our state almost never turns down additional funding. But we were also really unsure of how to roll this out because we already had an LFPI. So we already have something called 10 cents a meal for Michigan kids and farms. We sometimes call that 10 cents a meal for short. So this program provides like match funding for Michigan grown fruits, vegetables, and dried beans. Over the past 8 years or so, it grew from this small, like sort of grassroots level pilot into this $9.3 million program, permanent program in our state aid budget, which is amazing. But we're in this discussion, it was like, well, what are we going to do with LFS funds? We already have something. Another, I guess, challenge in our state is, probably with all states, is that procurement takes a really long time. And we were like, if we started doing procurement, it could take 12 months. So we decided we would like just basically align the two programs. So this meant that it would be sort of like a sister program. There wouldn't be a match requirement, and we would allow food beyond just fruits, vegetables, and dried beans. We expanded it to include meat, protein, dairy, some grains, and syrups, which was actually like really exciting to kind of see some of those food items. They had to be grown in Michigan, and if they were processed, it had to be minimally processed and also processed in Michigan. So very much like our 10 cents program, we were able to duplicate our invoice submission system. So part of the Local Food for Schools requirements is there's reporting involved back to the USDA. So that meant we had to see what people were purchasing. So we were actually able to duplicate our invoice submission system, basically a mirror image. So those that were already involved in it, it was not difficult for them to navigate. By allowing additional foods, that meant that we were able to start to make partnerships and learn about other growers, and also start creating a farm directory with foods beyond fruits, vegetables, and dried beans.
That's great. Thank you, Jaime. Next, Rick, I'm going to ask you the same question. So how have you been able to incorporate Local Food for Schools into your existing incentive in Oregon?
No problem. Thanks for having me on, everybody. My name's Rick Sherman, Oregon Department of Education. I'm the Farm to School Analyst here is my fancy title. And like Jaime, I'm a full-time farm to school guy, and I'm in charge of all of our farm to school grants and the fresh fruit and veggie program. So like Jaime indicated for us, this is, and what Cassandra said, this is a one-time cash influx. We already have a $10.6 million state grant that we operate. And 5.2 million of that is for food. And so we didn't want to duplicate efforts. So we kind of came up with a little compromise. We're using our LFS funds for anything that our state grant is not allowable. So we can go up to 400 miles outside of our state border, which that goes all the way to the Canadian border. So we can buy all the Bellingham produce for, and up there, and then all the way down over to like Missoula and down to San Francisco. So, I mean, so that helps out our border towns. Like if you're in Ontario, Oregon, local to them is Boise, Idaho, and there we aren't able to reimburse with our state grant for that. So we're able to use the regional aspect of this. So that's good. The other thing that USDA allows is they don't consider milk a processed food. And so our state grant doesn't allow milk half pints. So we're able to use that as well. So the only thing is, and I think Jaime was kind of alluding to this too, we have a procurement system. When you blow through all of your state grant funds, you can apply for more through a competitive reimbursement grant with our state grant. And the process with our procurement department takes a long time. We've lately, we're trying to work through that. So it's a burden on our sponsors that, it's hard for them to get the second bite of the apple, so to speak, or to get more funds. So with these funds, they already have an agreement signed. So what we've decided to do is say, we're allowing in-state purchases for unprocessed food. We just ask for them you have to be at a zero balance with your state grant. So once you've used up your state grant funds, an option to you might be to use the LFS funds to buy in-state or out-of-state purchases up to 400 miles, but it will alleviate them going through the procurement department to try to do that, the reimbursement, the competitive reimbursement. We still want to use all those funds. As we say, it'd be horrible to go across the street to my legislature and do a report and say, yeah, we left money on the table because we had these other funds, but we're trying our best to do both streams with this. The other aspect is, with no administrative dollars, it's easy for us to, like Jaime said, we duplicate our system. We just have a different system. People are already used to submitting claims. It's just that it's going to be difficult for new people coming in, new food service directors. I can see where they're going to be confused, like, wait, which one do I use? And so I'm just anticipating we're going to have to do a lot of hand-holding and stuff and pay special attention to our training that's on our website. Well, that's that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that overview, Rick. And so you started talking about this, but could you maybe expand more on how having these systems in place through your existing incentive program sort of supported LFS rollout? Yeah,
especially since, like I said, there's no, I know other states like Washington, they're doing things with their commodity dollars, and we don't have a lot of dollars for administrative to figure out something new. So we wanted to duplicate something that's already working. So I could basically use the same forms. We use tracking sheets. Anytime somebody sends us a claim, what they do is they send an Excel spreadsheet with everything listed where their stuff comes from. So we put it on a master sheet. So we're able to sort it and have literally tens of thousands of lines of product for each grant to say like where the items are coming from. So we can track if they're a marginalized group or whatever. We could kind of research all that stuff. But we already have, we do a lot of tracking through Excel. And once we approve the items and say, okay, it's good to go, you can enter the dollar amount in our electronic grant management system. It just does a dollar transfer, but we keep track of all of the stuff and we pre-approve everything. And then we can also If we want to do a review, we can pull somebody and say, okay, we picked you at random. You can send us your invoices now, and we'll double check them versus what you sent us. So that's how we do that.
Yeah, thanks for that additional information. That sounds really great. And you mentioned the administrative dollars. Jaime, I'm going to pass it back to you. Do you want to share more about how having 10 cents a meal in Michigan supported LFS rollout? Did you have a similar experience to Rick?
Yeah, it's funny listening to Rick because it sounds very similar in regards to how we collect data. I do want to mention that our goal for 10 cents would be to expand the types of food that we allow. And so having the data come from LFS will help us make that argument to expand our existing program. And I think that's a great thing to mention because we actually used 10 cents resources to create that technology. So that was kind of our goal, was they would feed on each other and they would help both programs sort of grow and expand and be successful. I wanted to mention that we were awarded $5.6 million, and we have reimbursed at least $4 million of that already, and we expect to fully spend all of the funds available to us. So that's a success. And then mentioning too, Rick mentioned milk. That has been a huge success for us as well, because we have school districts who have never purchased anything locally, or at least they think they haven't. We have a lot of charter schools in our state, a lot that work with ended school meal contracts, and by allowing different types of food, including milk, fluid milk, they are now participating, and now they're questioning, oh, maybe I should also participate in 10 cents. This was actually not that difficult to submit these invoices. So I think we've kind of like cracked into a population that we had not heard from before.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting to see what different states and how far along they are in LFS rollout. And I feel like Michigan is pretty far ahead. Is there anything more you want to share about your experience with LFS and how it's going?
I don't really have anything else to add. I think we should probably all kind of regroup again at some point in time and see like how everyone's program ended up, and see if their existing LFPI grew from this experience.
Yeah, well, definitely we'll be looking at expansion of products. I think you're right about evaluation being really needed, especially for this program and all of the impacts it's going to have and the ripple effects. So I think that's a good note to move on to our second section of panelists. Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Rick, for sharing more about your incentives in general and how LFS has intersected in there. So next, we are going to switch over and speak with Monica Pacheco and Eliana Pinilla about their experiences positioning LFS as a permanent LFPI. So my first question is for Eliana. So I'm interested to hear, as you are the only advocate on this panel, I'm interested to hear about your coalition and about the decision to say, hey, we have this LFS program coming down. What did it look like to decide that that should be leveraged for permanent investment? And what did that look like in practice and in advocacy? Yeah, share your story, please.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me part of this panel. As you mentioned, while I work for the Common Market, I am part of a larger coalition that formed last year, the Illinois Farm to School Coalition. We came together as a group with diverse voices and experiences in Illinois, from our Chicago Food Policy Action Council representatives, Illinois Public Health Institute, Illinois Stewardship Alliance, Farmers Market Associations, Farm Bureau, Especially Growers Association, and of course, towards the approaching the announcement of the Local Food for Schools funding, our Illinois State Board of Education folks joined the conversation. So it all started with convening with the Department of Agriculture and really trying to workshop through solutions on how to get some of the funding that was providing or supporting some school districts in purchasing local, namely ARPA funds. How do you progress that into space that you can give continuity to that program? And through that conversations, one of the solutions that the coalition came up with is incentive program, procurement incentive program. And at the same time, Local Food for Schools was coming in, and the idea was, well, rather than state funding or climbing up the hill right away of like state funding providing for that incentive, why not use LFS funding to support that process? And so through that, we were able to bring to the table ISB, Illinois State Board of Education, to how might they envision rolling this out in the absence of admin support at the time, and what are other resources that we can bring to the table from a coalition perspective to support that. And I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg for us, but a lot of the work that brought us to this point is very much hand in hand with the advocacy work that a lot of the partners in the coalition had done for the last 5 to 6 years. So Illinois Farm to School through 7 generations ahead, the Good Food Purchasing Initiative in Chicago right now, led by and facilitated by CIFPAC, to get institutions to adhere to more local procurement approaches, Illinois Stewardship Alliance, and Illinois Public Health Institute, which advocated heavily into the removal of the lowest cost bid in our procurement regulations, as well as pushing a bill which is it's subject to appropriation still, which is the Healthy Meals for All, or Healthy School Lunches Act, that is also kind of starting to bring into the conversation of what might not only bring online universal meals look like, but also the additive budget support for Local Food for Schools. So all this, what we hope is to bring up like a groundswell of data, information, experiences as we start some of that funding this year of Local Food for Schools, for a 2025 heavy advocacy for a bill that prolongs past the funding period for LFS.
Yeah, that's great. I love hearing about the coalition and all of the work leading up to now, and it being sort of this perfect storm of situations. So thanks for sharing what it's been like in Illinois. And now I have the same question for Monica. So I know you can't speak too much about advocacy as someone part of the State Department of Education, but I'm interested in what this looked like for you, positioning LFS as a permanent LFPI. So take it away.
Sure, thank you. Again, my name is Monica Pacheco. I'm with Connecticut State Department of Education. So, you know, I'm hearing many similar trains of thought from Eliana as I'm thinking about how it worked for us. Basically, our approach was, you know, seeing the funding that was coming from the federal government throughout the pandemic, in particular, you know, supply chain assistance funds. I think we were receiving our 3rd round at the time that the LFS was coming out. And obviously the universal meals, the funding for meals during the pandemic, had us looking at the LFS as a way of really putting an investment in a meaningful and sustainable program to support schools for local supply chain, local procurement. When the supply chain assistance funds came out, and since they are from that same CCC funding pool, we basically were encouraging schools to, you know, it had to be minimally or unprocessed foods. And we were making it as simple as possible for them because, you know, the pandemic had everyone scrambling, and we really wanted to make sure those funds were used and used in a way that they could with the least amount of burden, but with the with the local food for school incentive, we really wanted to take a step back and think about how we could really use this for what it was intended, to really look at developing those relationships, developing a sustainable program that the schools would be able to take beyond the time frame of the funding for LFS. In Connecticut, we did ask for the 1-year extension. You could do up to a 1-year extension. Initially, it was 18 months. And as the wheels of progress sometimes don't move as quickly as we would like, we were able to get the additional year, which has given us a lot of additional time to work on this. And similar to some of the other stories you're hearing, and that perfect storm is certainly what I would equate to what happened in Connecticut. We had this groundswell of community farm to school supporters coming forward with looking at the fact that since we had universal meals during the pandemic, can we do it at the state level? Since we had, we also had a local or state Connecticut Grown for Connecticut Kids grant program that used some ARPA funds that the state had designated to that to support building infrastructure and things for the schools. And that was short-lived if we didn't find a state level funding source for that permanently. So we sort of had our group of advocates coming forward from food. We're a food corps state, so we have strong support from our food corps team. We have the Farm to School Collaborative, also similar to many other states. Our School Nutrition Association of Connecticut was a strong supporter and help with things. And our advocacy folks like End Hunger Connecticut's all stepped up. So, I can't, but I didn't have to. We had a wonderful team ready to go forward and support these initiatives and work on that. We certainly had stories. I did ask from someone with our advocacy side what was a good story there. And basically, they basically said that when people asked about whether or not we should position the state funding more just as a pilot, the answer was no, we don't have to. We have a pilot already started. So that was a nice way to position the LFS funding as well as transitioning to state funding that way. We just talked about the investments to the local economy, as many people do. We bundled, the universal meals with our grant program and with the incentive program kind of together and that really, I think, helped push it through more. And many of funding takes a lot of funding from the federal level, rather takes a lot of reporting. So we also are really trying to position the reporting that we need for LFS to also then be able to transition pretty smoothly to the type of reporting that we would want for the state level program.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that, Monica. And it's interesting how in the first section we heard from Jaime and Rick about how their child nutrition program managers were well equipped. They knew who to buy from. They knew sort of how tracking worked. And so now on the flip side, you're saying in Connecticut that now because of LFS, there's these systems in place that are going to help implementation be smooth. So that's really a good point. I guess, so I feel like a lot of folks listening in today will be from states that don't have an incentive program, and they'll be interested to hear if you have any advice for them on how they might be able to talk about LFS rollout in terms of advocacy. So you mentioned stories, you mentioned coalition partners. What is some of your advice for folks in this room?
Sure. Well, we were lucky enough in Connecticut that our Department of Ag had just commissioned our University of Connecticut policy office to do a survey. So we had some data. And one of the questions that we used a lot, or one of the data points that we used a lot that came out of it, was that when asked, over 95% of the school directors that were surveyed would participate more in and be interested in purchasing more local product if there was the additional funding. So that was a nice, strong data point to bring forward. So if you have anything like that, I would, definitely talk that up. and telling stories. Again, because we had such a wonderful group of folks involved in the advocacy work, we had school directors, we had students going up to the Capitol on testifying days to talk about what they're doing. Again, some of the grants that we had through that temporary funding were already in action, so they could speak to those. They spoke to the universal meals that they'd been experiencing through the pandemic. And let me tell you, nothing is better than to legislators and to press than to have kids up at the Capitol. So that was a big win. We also, again, because it's a little newer to us, wanted to really make sure that the schools, the directors had the tools to advocate themselves and to also invite their legislators to the schools, again, to show the fundings at work, to show the good work Universal Meals is in their district, to thank them for approving and for voting for these things so that they would see their vote in action. Again, also along with the fact that that we positioned the LFS as a pilot when they asked about whether or not we needed a pilot first. It also helped kind of add to the urgency or the importance of needing new funding, because we talked about how the federal dollars had a very finite end to them, and we didn't want to see the drop off. We wanted to make sure that we continue to invest in the local sourcing, and we might see a drop off if there wasn't a state level incentive program to back that up. And as with what a pilot should be, we were going to be able to show, hopefully, to work out kinks and figure out some of the little bugs that might come along with a new program, and then, be positioned ready to go into the state program, having taken care of some of the little learning curves that are necessary when you're initiating something like this.
Yeah, really useful points, Monica. I love the drop off. I love the sort of synergy with universal meals, which is something we're really diving deep in at the National Farm to School Network. And I think that's a great segue to Eliana, who I know Illinois is doing some of that positioning, universal meals, local food purchasing incentive. And so I will ask you the same question that I just asked Monica, which is, what's your advice for advocates on how to do this positioning? Do you have any strategies that you've used that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we were very fortunate as a coalition is the interest of our Board of Education to figure out how to do this in the absence of admin dollars. And that prompted us to be create the connections to learn from others that have been successful at doing it. Michigan, who's in the call here, we had the fortune to connect with Wendy Crawley, and with Minnesota, with Kate Siebold, and in Washington with Farm to School with Annette Slonin. So we had the opportunity to learn what has worked, what hasn't, take a page from their book. We also, as the Common Market was coming online into the Great Lakes, had the opportunity to bring some experiences from other parts of the country where we were facilitating also procurement incentives, namely in New Jersey through some of the work we were doing with the different school districts there. Our Director of National Partnerships, Rachel Terry, has been fundamental on that. And so just bringing a lot of the learnings from that into how do we formulate a productive use of LFS fundings for a pilot to do what Monica was sharing earlier, work out the kinks. And that's one of the main things that our SV lead mentioned. Lindsay Blow just is very excited to see like how this could, propel schools to figure out what does it mean working with farmers directly, with organizations like the Common Market, like, what needs to be true for them to do it successfully. And so, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say like the coalition piece. So like joining forces with others that are in different parts of the conversation has been fundamental to the solid policy development by those that are closer in that realm of the work of like making something that resonates for both like our schools, growers, and the folks that are in the middle, like Common Market, that are facilitating it. And lastly, I think I'd say staying and maintaining a level of flexibility in the process. I think we're talking about implementation, of course, at a state level, but when you're executing this program, especially in states like Illinois that local food procurement still very nascent, or is still kind of like in the process of becoming more implemented, used in our procurement systems, is thinking about how do you keep interest of schools in participating in this program, the willingness to collaborate closely with them and determine how does this look in their district based on their current infrastructure. I think that that's very critical. And same thing with growers, right? And I think that alludes to the follow-up webinar that's happening, which is how do you also create sound pathways for growers to remain involved in this type of work. So those are my 3 key pieces of advice, our 2 cents from Illinois.
Yes, thank you for your 2 or 3 or how many cents you're willing to share. And thank you, Eliana. Thank you, Monica. Those are the questions I have for section 2. Let me replace Spotlight. Yeah, so I love that, working out the kinks. I love putting the focus on farmers and producers and making sure that there's a sustained market channel for those folks to be in the conversation. And thanks for sharing more tips on advocacy. So for our last section, we are going to hear from 2 states, one with an existing incentive program, so Washington, one without, Rhode Island. We are going to hear from them about how they're doing something unique. So about a handful of states are contracting, instead of with schools, for purchases of local funds, they're contracting directly with producers and vendors to get this food into schools. So my first question is for Jessica Petrolia. Can you share more about this LFS model and why you chose it for Rhode Island?
Sure. Thanks, Cassandra. So hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Petrolia. I'm the coordinator of child nutrition programs for the Rhode Island Department of Education. And for our LFS funding, we actually were in the position when these funds came out that we had already held back 10% of our supply chain assistance funding for local purchasing, but we didn't really know what we were going to do with it. And we were struggling to figure that out at the same time that the LFS funds came out. Luckily for us, our partner agency, Rhode Island DEM, was working through their LFPA application at the same time, all these acronyms. And they developed this model in which they're contracting with our local food hub, Farm Fresh Rhode Island, in order to be able to leverage their LFPA funds. And the more that we thought about it, the more we thought that that could be a model that would work for us, both for our supply chain assistance and our LFS funds. So basically, we at RIDE entered into a contract with our local food hub in which we established accounts really similar to like a Department of Defense produce program model, where the hub manages the accounts, each SFA is allocated a balance, and then they can draw down from that balance to purchase qualifying items through the food hub. And what's been really great about that for us is, one, we were really concerned about trying to manage a reimbursement model where we were then having to potentially like collect a lot of invoices or vet whether or not purchases really met the qualifications. Because we don't have a local purchasing incentive program in place, we're not already in a position where we have a process established for that. Also, from like an intended use perspective of what these funds were meant to do, we were concerned that we would see our schools not really expanding their relationships with the intended local producers, but just kind of using these funds to support existing relationships without seeing growth. But also, we have a really heavy food service management company presence in Rhode Island. And one of our biggest barriers to farm to school in general is being able to get our local producers into those food service management company supply chains. And so by the state managing the contract, we completely bypassed the need for that, and also made it so we were contracting with just one entity, the food hub, rather than a bunch of different producers. And so it's made one central access point. It's really made the whole process a lot easier.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And I did notice that I think some of the states that have this producer forward model are doing a similar thing with their LFPA, Local Food Purchasing Assistance Program funds. So it's interesting that both of those could work together really well. So great. I'm going to now ask Erica Lamson the same question. I know that rather than working with a food hub, you did something completely different. So do you mind sharing a little bit about Washington's model and why you may have chosen it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us today. Again, my name's Erica Lamson. I work for the Washington State Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And in Washington, we decided to use our LFS funds to explore a centralized purchasing model. So at the time we applied for LFS, we had just been awarded a USDA Farm to School grant to explore and pilot centralized purchasing using our USDA Foods Distribution Program. So we were really already thinking about how to use that distribution system to move local food to schools around the state. And LFS really just helped us jumpstart that pilot project. I'll start by giving you a little backstory and context to this to better understand it. So I think it's a little bit of an unusual approach. In Washington, we contract with 3 frozen and dry warehouses around the state to receive, store, and ship out USDA commodities to school districts. We handle that ordering in-house and then contract out for the warehousing, logistics, and transportation. With the LFS project, we wanted to harness the power of that massive logistical dance to move local food out to school districts and address a couple of the common farm to school barriers we see. Those are things like we wanted to decrease the administrative burden of local purchasing and also simplify some of the transportation and logistics for school districts. To that end, what we propose to do with the LFS funds are to directly purchase food grown within 400 miles of a warehouse, to have producers deliver food directly to those warehouses, have school districts order those foods using the same order system that they use currently for their USDA food commodities, and to have it delivered out to the districts alongside their commodity orders. Our first task to accomplish that was to create a request for proposals, and we got a really good response to that RFP, so that in the end we were able to award 9 contracts to 9 different producers, farmer cooperatives, food hubs, and small distributors, and have 23 different frozen and dry foods that are coming in as part of the LFS project. Right now, we're just getting started, and this week, in fact, marks the first delivery of products out to our warehouses, so we're super excited about that. We're just trying to be very thoughtful when we set up that system so that we make sure that it works for everybody involved in the long term. Because after the funds run out, we really want a system that is super solid so that we can smoothly transition to a model where we at the state continue to do the procurement and the school districts reimburse us for those purchases.
Yeah. Thanks for walking us through the design and how you came up with it. And I'm wondering, I know you said you just started, but I'm wondering if you can name any disadvantages to this model or advantages. I know you mentioned that they sort of circumvent a lot of the challenges for child nutrition program managers, but anything else you'd like to share would be welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So we at the state really experience a lot of the same advantage and disadvantages as our school district partners when purchasing directly from producers. We have administrative overhead costs, just like the school districts have. So when purchasing directly, there are RFPs to write and contracts to draft and logistics to manage and other administrative type tasks associated with that purchasing. That said, and as you mentioned, Cassandra, by taking that administrative burden ourselves, we are lessening the burden on school districts, and that's a really huge benefit. There are also just inherent efficiencies to be gained through centralizing some of the administrative tasks. And while this does increase our administrative burden, it carries advantages with it. So for instance, through our experience with the LFS project, we've really broadened our institutional understanding of the food system so that we better understand the challenges and needs of producers. And we've developed relationships with producers along the way. And all of that will surely benefit other work that we do in the future. Additionally, we're creating resources that make marketing, promotion, and education about farm products easier for districts. We know that education and promotion is a really critical piece of farm to school efforts. And by doing this at the state level, we have more consistent messaging, and we also decrease the burden on school districts to come up with the materials themselves. And that's a huge win for districts, as it's one less thing for busy food service directors to think about. And to that end, really the benefit is to the school districts, the producers, the students, and the school community who are all learning about these products. So while we really increase our administrative burden, it lessens the burden for others involved, and that just feels like a huge benefit.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about that. And also, I really like the idea that because you have specific products that you're working with, you can now put more energy into advertising those and marketing them. And I think that's really smart. So now I'm going to ask Jessica. I know that while Washington placed some of the administrative burden on the department, you sort of are working with Farm Fresh Rhode Island, who's spearheading a lot of that administration for your department. So can you talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages to your model that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I would really echo what Eric has said. Even having Farm Fresh manage a lot of the administrative burden, in that they're actually doing the direct outreach to the farmers and producers, which is huge. So we don't need to do that. We are still centralizing, the contractual burden at the state agency, and there's a significant benefit to our SFAs from that. We're also seeing the benefit then of being able to more directly support the marketing of a particular product. Seafood has been a specific interest in the state. And so we're talking about using other funding streams like our Farm to School Formula Grant funding to now come up with specific seafood marketing materials that will then support funds that we channel through LFS and SCA to those particular products. So that's also been successful. I also talked about already the idea of kind of circumventing that food service management company's supply chain issue. That's been a huge success in the use of this model. There is still, even doing it this way, there is a lot of legwork that's involved. It has allowed us, though, to have more, I think, collective impact rather than being in a position where the funds are going to the schools and then we're having to hope that they are creating those relationships themselves. We're also having to hope that they're creating the relationships in a way that's meaningful for the farmer. So if we're talking about really wanting to increase capacity, increase the share that our farmers are selling into our schools, it's hard to do that when it's independently managed by each individual SFA. And this way, because we're managing the connections, we're seeing real change where we'll have a producer come back and say, you've bought out my whole supply of this. And that's something we weren't seeing before. So that's been really successful.
Yeah. Oh, I love that story. That way they're sort of managing the actual farmer impact and being able to share that out, which you're right, I do think is lost in other more decentralized models. And so that brings me to my last set of questions for you both. Jessica, I know we've talked about this offline, but how do you feel about this model continuing in Rhode Island or something similar that's producer forward?
Yeah, when you first asked me this the other day, I got so tangled up in the logistics of how would it work to incentivize farmers. And I think the answer is it already does work. We do this on a grand scale through USDA Foods. Then at a national level, we appropriate funding and then we enter into contracts to subsidize big ag. And so my point all along has been, if we can do it for big ag, why can't we do it for little ag? So if we have funding in our states that we can set up in a similar distribution model, whether it's the DoD Fresh Produce model or the USDA Foods model, that allows us to support farmers in a way where they can sustainably plan to have a market that meets their needs, not only in terms of what they want to grow, but the price that they need to sell it at in order for it to be sustainable for their business. I really think, this model for us has already shown because we started out with this setting up accounts that schools can draw down from, there is still an amount of needing to get the schools to buy into it. So it's not just a matter of if you provide them the funding, they will come to the local produce. It's not true. And so if we want to recognize the real benefit of supporting our local agriculture, I think we need to find a way to shift the model. And I think it can work. And I think we have proven concept in other forms. We just need to take it and apply it.
Excellent. Thank you for your perspective, Jessica. And Erica, I will ask you the same thing. I know that Washington has an existing incentive. So, you know, something I'm thinking about is like, how do you do both of these things at once? And I'm just curious how you feel about moving forward with this model.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Cassandra, we do already have a local purchasing grant in place, and it's in its third year of providing funding directly to school districts. And our LFS project is really distinct from that. And in fact, they're administered by two different state agencies. So our LFS work is administered by the agency I work for, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the local purchasing grants are administered by our State Department of Agriculture. And that partnership between the two agencies really helps provide the capacity to administer both programs. Each agency provides support for the program they aren't directly administering, and that's really helped to build the capacity across the state for this work in the long term. And then like our aim with LFS is to really be additive rather than duplicative. In other words, we're aware that there's a risk to centralized purchasing, so that risk is that that the centralized purchase will displace already established local purchasing arrangements. And we're really trying to monitor that to find strategies to mitigate that risk. That said, I think there's like slightly different scales operating here. So very small producers have difficulty meeting the quantity necessary for statewide purchases, but those producers are perfect for establishing that direct buying relationship with school districts through our local purchasing grants. So we think that this centralized purchasing model is really creating an additional farm to school marketplace for mid-sized producers rather than displacing existing buying relationships. And in terms of the long term, we're really trying to be slow and intentional and take a lot of feedback as we move forward so that we're mitigating any unintended consequences and set up a sustainable system that really works to increase the overall proportion of the school food dollar that's spent on local food.
That's great. Yeah. I like thinking about different scales of local agriculture and seeing how you can support producers in, you know, large, small, and different communities and supporting those relationships. Great. So now we're going to move it to the Q&A. I want to thank all of our 6 presenters talking about their state stories. I'm going to try to spotlight everyone now, so hopefully that works out. But yeah, thank you all. I know we have some questions in the chat, so I am going to try to see if there's a good question to start with, unless someone on the panel has one that they've seen that they'd like to address. That would be helpful. One I see that was in the beginning is, what are some states' criteria for prioritizing socially disadvantaged producers? So I know all states are doing it differently, and I'm wondering if there's one particular approach y'all want to share.
Hi, this is Monica from Connecticut. So what we are doing is with our LFS, we are providing it as a 2-tier program. An initial outlay of the funding is going to our schools based on their enrollment. We are encouraging but not requiring that they work with socially disadvantaged or small producers. We work closely with our Department of Ag, who administered the LFPA, and they also had that criteria as part of that. So they helped they help to do some of the vetting and some of the establishment of those criteria already. And we don't want that to be something that we have to have our SFAs worry about. And when we move to our second tier, where we are going to take a smaller group of directors who really want to dig into long-term contracting and establishing, again, these long-term relationships that go beyond the time frame of the federal funding, we will make it a requirement. And at that point, we will help schools to identify that so that it's not, again, on them. And we have sort of a baseline already established based on some of the work that Department of Ag is already doing.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Monica. We have a question about food service management companies and LFS funds, and how some states are navigating that intersection. So if anyone has any advice for how they're addressing it, that would be welcome.
I know I'm the one that mentioned food service management companies. I mean, I can just say from our end, the easiest way to address it was to remove the food service management companies from the equation. And that was through that direct contracting model with the food hub. It no longer relied on things going and flowing through that food service management company supply chain in order to use the funds. And that's been really successful for us.
That's great. Thanks, Jessica. And I also want to just call out a comment when we're talking about interesting incentive models, that there's talk in the chat about switching from subsidized the consumption of food, like procurement, to subsidizing actually staff and hiring people to grow local food at institutions. I think that's also a really innovative model. We have a question, which is what happens though when each school district has different thresholds and rules for procurement? So I think that that's a really great question. Procurement is dictated by federal, state, and local guidelines. And so I'm wondering if anyone here has seen how procurement sort of shakes out within different districts in their states.
Cassandra, I respond or try to. I also do procurement work with the Department of Ed. I had responded in the chat that if they were talking about any of the states doing a state level procurement, that those would be formal, and those are always okay because you can always go more formal. You just can't go less formal depending on individual thresholds. So, you know, again, in Connecticut, our initial outlay is half of what we were allocated. And so for some of our districts, it's going to be fairly small sums of money just to, again, hopefully get everyone to take a taste of what it's like to do farm to school, especially for those who may not have done it in the past. So we talk about micro purchasing and small purchasing and how those are not overly burdensome. And we have tools, and we'll be doing some more training, as well as getting back to some of our general procurement trainings that kind of got put on hold during the pandemic to remind schools that it doesn't have to be complicated, and to you know, work with them on those smaller purchases.
Thank you, Monica. And we have one question, which I think I maybe want to do a lightning round with our panelists to close it out, which is, if you could improve the program, what change would you want to see at the state or federal level? So, Jaime, I'm going to pass it over to you. If you could improve LFS, what would you do?
I never want to sound negative, but include admin dollars to help pay for staff, or even technology, one or the other. That's really my only takeaway. Everything else was okay in my book. So, and I see others nodding, so I think that's probably everyone's answer.
I know when I asked that, I was like, I feel like I know what everyone's going to say, but Rick, what would you say?
Exactly what she said. Plus, the LFS funds, I don't appreciate the fact that they're a one-time cash thing, because that gets everybody all up and ready and used to something, and then the plug gets pulled. So permanent funding would be great too.
Yeah, and that's definitely a central theme to this conversation, is how do we turn LFS into permanent? state investment at the very least. So yeah, next I'll turn it to Eliana. What would you change?
Ditto to what has been said so far, I think just because of the experience as a coalition would be we relied on like the relationships that we had to figure out how to connect with people that are already doing it. So I think if there was, if they have the extra time and the extra resources, kind of like mentoring, right? Like who could they say that's aspiring to put this online, like who could they connect with, right? To work through the different questions that I have, because sometimes it feels like you're in this vacuum that you're trying to make decisions. And I guess we do have the information of like what works with our state and our systems and all that stuff, but it is always nice to have a soundboard. So that would be my only add.
Thank you. And Monica.
So I'll start with ditto to the admin and what everyone else was saying. But I think the other thing that would be great is an ability to have some sort of centralized repository for tools and tips that could be shared more easily. There's some great things being done by all the states here, but you do still have to do a little bit of digging to find it. If I think we're all guilty and famous for, don't create the wheel if someone else has already started it, and we're trying to use other tools that may be already out there, and having an opportunity to have that somewhere where it was really easy to find would be great to help programs.
Awesome. Thank you. Erica, any changes?
Well, I think, again, a ditto to all the great comments that have been made here. I come back to something Jessica said during her part of the presentation in terms of the USDA Foods providing that existing subsidy to larger farms. So continuing, that would be my number one, is just continuing LFS funding to be able to provide that subsidy for small farms.
Great. Thank you. And Jessica, I'll give you the final word.
Okay, so yes, and I would have it administered by FNS and not AMS. For those of us who are administering it, it's harder to work with a different agency, and allow it to be applicable to all child nutrition programs that a school runs, including summer and child and adult care.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Thanks everyone for coming and listening today. Thanks for sharing your stories. Thank you to Colleen Matz, my collaborator and amazing supporter of all of these webinars. Thank you to the panelists. I will send their information in a follow-up email, and feel free to contact them or me. And lastly, if you're interested in a Farmer First model, I hope to hear from you on October 11th. So have a great weekend, everyone, and stay in touch.